The day I loaded my grandfather's vintage manure spreader onto my F-250 and drove it through the gates of Meadowbrook Estates was the day I realized just how fragile suburban peace could be. I had moved to this development in Cedar Rapids, Iowa 3 months earlier, buying a corner lot that backed up to an old agricultural easement. The property was perfect for what I needed. Half an acre with southern exposure and soil that hadn't been completely destroyed by construction equipment. My name is Tyler Garrison, and I had spent the last 5 years learning everything I could about organic farming while working a soul-crushing desk job in Chicago. When my grandmother passed and left me enough money for a down payment, I saw my chance to escape and start the organic vegetable operation I had been dreaming about. The HOA president, a woman named Patricia Thornhill, had already made her presence known during my first week. She had knocked on my door at 7 in the morning on a Saturday to inform me that my fence posts were 3 inches too tall according to the community guidelines. I had smiled, nodded, and cut 3 inches off every post that afternoon. I was determined to keep the peace and focus on my gardens. But the manure spreader was different. I needed it, and I was well within my rights to have it. What in God's name is that? Patricia's voice rang out across my driveway before I had even finished backing the trailer into position near my garden plots. She was standing at the edge of my property line, wearing a cream-colored pantsuit despite the 80-degree heat, her arms crossed over her chest. I climbed down from the truck and wiped my hands on my jeans. "It's a manure spreader. I'm fertilizing my vegetable beds." "You absolutely cannot have that thing here. This is a residential neighborhood, not a farm." "Actually, according to the county zoning laws, I can grow and sell produce from my property as long as I stay under certain acreage limits. I checked before I moved in." Patricia's face was turning an impressive shade of red. "I don't care what the county says. Our HOA covenants clearly state that no agricultural equipment can be stored on properties within Meadowbrook Estates." I had read those covenants front to back. "The covenant says no permanent agricultural structures and no commercial farming equipment storage. This is temporary equipment being used for a legitimate purpose. I'll have it back to my grandfather's barn in North Liberty by tomorrow evening. We'll see about that." She pulled out her phone and started stabbing at the screen with one manicured fingernail. I turned back to my work. The manure I had sourced from a certified organic farm outside of Marion needed to be spread today. I had 8 raised beds and 2 larger in-ground plots that required the amendment before I could plant my fall crops. The extension office had helped me plan this whole operation, and I had permits for everything. The spreader was a beautiful piece of equipment, really. Built in 1967, it had been maintained meticulously by my grandfather until he sold his farm 10 years ago. The red paint had faded to a rusty orange, and the mechanical parts still functioned perfectly. I had already loaded it with composted horse manure from a local stable that specialized in organic bedding. I was adjusting the spreader settings when a Cedar Rapids police cruiser rolled up to my curb. Officer Martinez stepped out, looking distinctly uncomfortable. He was young, probably in his late 20s, and he kept glancing between Patricia and me like he was trying to figure out how he had drawn this particular short straw. "Afternoon," he said. "We got a call about a disturbance." "There's no disturbance," I said. "I'm fertilizing my vegetable gardens." "With that," Martinez gestured at the manure spreader. "Yes, sir. It's composted horse manure from Riverside Stables. I have the receipt and the organic certification if you need to see it." Patricia stepped forward. "Officer, this man is creating a public nuisance. That thing smells terrible and he's violating our HOA covenants." Martinez walked closer to the spreader and sniffed cautiously. "Madam, I don't smell much of anything. Composted manure doesn't really have a strong odor." "Well, it will once he starts spreading it around." "Is there a law against using fertilizer on private property?" I asked. Martinez looked relieved to have a straightforward answer. "No, sir, there is not. As long as you're not creating a legitimate public health hazard or nuisance, you're within your rights to fertilize your garden however you see fit." "This is outrageous," Patricia snapped. "I'm calling the HOA board. We'll file an injunction." "Madam, that's between you and the homeowner. Unless there's an actual violation of city ordinances or state law, this is a civil matter." Martinez nodded at me. "Sir, I'd recommend keeping things as clean and odor-free as possible just to be neighborly." "That's my plan, officer. Like I said, this equipment will be gone by tomorrow evening." After Martinez left, Patricia remained on the property line, making phone calls. I ignored her and got to work. The spreader operated on a simple ground-driven mechanism. As I pulled it slowly with my lawn tractor, the manure dropped out in an even layer across the soil. The smell was earthy and rich, not unpleasant at all to anyone who had spent time around actual farms. I had finished 2 of the raised beds when more cars started pulling up. 4 other people emerged, all looking like they had interrupted important Saturday afternoon plans to rush over here. I recognized 2 of them from the neighborhood. Jennifer Morrison, who lived 3 houses down and had once complained about my heirloom tomato plants being visible from the street, and Donald Fletcher, who had told me during a chance meeting at the mailbox that all this organic nonsense was just a marketing scam. "You see what I mean," Patricia was saying to the group. "He's turning this neighborhood into a barnyard." A woman I didn't recognize walked over to me. She was older, probably in her 60s, with steel gray hair and intelligent eyes. "I'm Carol Chen. I'm on the HOA board." "May I ask what you're applying to your gardens?" I appreciated the civil tone. "Composted horse manure. It's been aged for 18 months and is certified organic. I'm using it to amend the soil before planting fall vegetables." "And you're planning to sell these vegetables?" "Some of them, yes. I have a micro-farm permit from the county that allows me to sell up to $5,000 of produce annually from my property. I'll mostly be selling at the Marion Farmers Market." Carol nodded slowly. "Do you have documentation for all of this?" "Everything. Permits, soil tests, organic certifications, even a letter from the Iowa State Extension Office explaining the agricultural exemptions." "I'd like to see that documentation if you don't mind." "Not because I'm trying to stop you, but because I want to understand what's legal and what isn't before this gets out of hand." I liked Carol immediately. I pulled off my work gloves and went inside to gather my folder of documents. When I returned, the group had grown to 7 people. Patricia was holding court, gesturing dramatically at my garden plots. "The property values will plummet. Who wants to live next to a farm? We'll all lose thousands on our investments." Carol took the folder from me and started reading through it carefully. After a few minutes, she looked up. "This all seems to be in order. Tyler has the right permits, and he's following the county agricultural exemption for micro-farms. The Iowa Right to Farm Act also protects his ability to conduct these activities. The HOA covenants supersede county permits," Donald Fletcher said. "Actually, they don't. Not when state law is involved," Carol replied. "The Right to Farm Act specifically prevents HOAs from prohibiting reasonable agricultural activities on properties zoned for such use. Our neighborhood is not zoned agricultural," Patricia said triumphantly. Carol looked at me. "What's your zoning?" "R1, a residential agricultural." The county has a hybrid zoning classification for areas that used to be farmland but have been developed for housing. It allows for limited agricultural use on parcels over a quarter acre. I could see the moment Patricia realized she was losing ground. Her expression hardened. Fine. If the law won't protect us, we'll make his life so difficult he'll wish he'd never moved here. Patricia, that sounds dangerously close to harassment, Carol warned. I'm simply stating that the HOA board has many tools at our disposal to ensure community standards are maintained. Over the next 2 hours, I finished spreading the manure on all my garden plots. More neighbors came and went. Some were curious and asked genuine questions about what I was growing and how organic farming worked. Others stood with Patricia's group, glaring at me like I had personally insulted their families. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who lived directly next door, came out with a glass of lemonade for me. "I think what you're doing is wonderful," she said quietly. "My father had a victory garden during the war, best vegetables I ever tasted." "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. That means a lot." "Don't let Patricia bully you. She's been trying to run this neighborhood like her personal fiefdom since we moved in 5 years ago. Someone needs to stand up to her." By evening, I had the spreader cleaned and the manure worked into the soil. The plots looked dark and rich, ready for planting. I was exhausted but satisfied. This was exactly the life I had wanted to build. Monday morning, I received a certified letter from the HOA. Inside was a notice of violation for unauthorized agricultural equipment, creation of olfactory nuisance, and violation of community aesthetic standards. I was being fined $500 and given 10 days to remediate the violations. I called the Iowa State Extension Office and asked to speak with my advisor, Marcus Webb. I had been working with him for months, getting advice on organic certification and sustainable growing practices. "Marcus, the HOA is fining me for spreading manure on my vegetable plots. Did you use the composted horse manure we discussed?" "Yes, exactly as planned. Everything was properly aged and certified organic." "Then you're absolutely in the right. What you're doing is standard agricultural practice. Let me send you a formal letter explaining that. And Tyler, you might want to talk to a lawyer about this. HOAs can be relentless when they decide someone is violating their vision of how things should be." The letter from the Extension Office arrived 2 days later. It was detailed and professional, explaining that manure spreading for vegetable plot fertilization was a recognized and recommended practice, that properly composted manure posed no health hazards, and that my activities fell well within the scope of legitimate organic farming operations. Marcus had even included citations from Iowa agricultural codes and university research papers. I sent a copy to the HOA board along with a formal response disputing the fines. I explained that I had violated no actual covenants, that I was protected by state agricultural laws, and that I would not be paying the fines. Patricia's response came via email the next day. She was escalating the matter to the HOA's legal team and placing a lien on my property for the unpaid fines plus administrative fees. That's when I called Richard Tomlinson, a real estate attorney in Cedar Rapids who had handled my home purchase. Richard listened to my story and asked me to send him all the documentation. "This is actually pretty straightforward," he said when he called me back. "The HOA is clearly in the wrong. Iowa law strongly protects agricultural activities, and you have all your permits in order. The problem is, fighting this could cost you thousands in legal fees even though you'll almost certainly win. What are my options?" Let me send them a letter laying out the legal situation. Sometimes that's enough to make them back down. If not, we can file a motion to remove the lien and sue for harassment. But Tyler, be prepared for this to get ugly. HOAs hate to lose, especially when a single homeowner challenges their authority. Richard's letter went out the next day. It was 8 pages of legal reasoning, case citations, and a clear warning that continuing this action could expose the HOA to liability for harassment and violation of state agricultural protection laws. For a week, things were quiet. I planted my fall crops, 3 varieties of heirloom tomatoes, bell peppers, zucchini, butternut squash, several types of lettuce, kale, Swiss chard, and herbs. The manure had enriched the soil beautifully. Everything was growing perfectly. Then the inspection started. First came the building inspector, responding to an anonymous complaint about unpermitted structures. He walked around my property, examined my raised beds, and shook his head. "These are garden beds, not structures. You don't need a permit for these. Someone's wasting city resources." 2 days later, a health inspector arrived, investigating complaints about organic waste storage creating pest harborage. She found my compost bins, which were commercially manufactured and properly maintained, and my small tool shed. "Everything looks fine. Keep doing what you're doing." The fire marshal came next, checking for illegal burning activities. I didn't even have a fire pit. Each time, I had to take time away from my work to deal with these inspections. Each time, the inspectors found nothing wrong and seemed increasingly annoyed that they were being sent on wild goose chases. On a Thursday afternoon, I was watering my plants when Patricia approached my property line again. This time, she had a professional-looking man in a suit with her. "This is Bernard Shaw from our legal team," she announced. "He's documented several clear violations of HOA covenants." Bernard looked deeply uncomfortable. "Mr. Garrison, I'm required to inform you that the HOA board has documented the following: visible vegetable plants from public streets, non-ornamental usage of front yard space, and commercial activity conducted from a residential property. The vegetable plants are legal under county micro-farm provisions. The front yard space usage is not restricted by any covenant as long as I maintain the grass, which I do, and the commercial activity is permitted by my micro-farm license. The covenants state that all visible plantings must be ornamental in nature and consistent with neighborhood aesthetics. I had read every single word of those covenants multiple times now. "Show me where it says that." Bernard pulled out a copy and flipped to a marked section. "Here. Section 4.7. All landscaping visible from public thoroughfares must maintain aesthetic harmony with the community character." That's subjective language that can't be enforced to prohibit legal agricultural activities protected by state law. "Mr. Shaw," a voice called out. Carol Chen was walking across her lawn toward us. "I'm also on the HOA board, and I don't recall voting to authorize legal action on this matter." Bernard looked between Carol and Patricia. "Mrs. Thornhill said she had board approval for a consultation, yes, not for formal legal action." "Patricia, we need to call a full board meeting before this goes any further." Patricia's expression could have curdled milk. "This is within my authority as president." "No, actually, it isn't. The bylaws require a board vote for any legal expenditure over $500. "Mr. Shaw, how much has your firm billed us so far for this matter?" Bernard shifted his weight. "Approximately $1,800. "Then we have a problem. Patricia, consider this my formal call for an emergency board meeting. Tonight, 7 p.m., the community center." The emergency board meeting was packed. Apparently word had spread through the neighborhood, and at least 40 people showed up. I sat in the back row with my folder of documentation, watching the board members file in. Besides Patricia and Carol, there were three others. Jennifer Morrison, who I already knew disliked me, Marcus Pritchard, a middle-aged accountant who had never spoken to me, and Susan Walsh, a young woman who had just moved to the neighborhood 6 months ago. Patricia called the meeting to order and immediately launched into a presentation about protecting property values and maintaining community standards. She had prepared a PowerPoint presentation with photos of my garden plots, the manure spreader, and even some screenshots of farmers' market websites where I had expressed interest in selling my produce. "This sets a dangerous precedent," Patricia said, clicking to a slide that showed a graph of theoretical property value decline. "If we allow one person to turn their yard into a farm, what's next? Chicken coops, goat pens. We must enforce our covenants strictly or risk losing everything that makes Meadowbrook Estates desirable." Carol raised her hand. "Patricia, do you have any actual evidence that Tyler's garden has affected property values? It's common sense." "That's not evidence." "Has anyone complained besides you and Jennifer?" Jennifer spoke up. "I've heard concerns from several neighbors. Concerns aren't the same as documented property value impacts. And Tyler, would you like to present your side?" I stood up and walked to the front. I handed out copies of all my documentation. The micro farm permit, the extension office letter, the Iowa Right to Farm Act provisions, the organic certifications, and Richard Tomlinson's legal analysis. "I understand that my garden isn't what everyone expected when they moved to this neighborhood," I said. "But I've followed every rule, obtained every permit, and operated within my legal rights. I'm not running a commercial farm. I'm growing vegetables on half an acre and selling some of them at farmers' markets. This is exactly the kind of activity that Iowa law protects because it supports local food systems and agricultural heritage." Marcus Pritchard, who had been reading through the documents, looked up. "This letter from the Extension Office is pretty clear. They're saying what you're doing is not just legal but recommended agricultural practice." "The Extension Office doesn't govern our HOA," Patricia snapped. "No, but state law does," Carol said. "And from what I'm reading here, we don't have a legal leg to stand on. If we continue this action, we could be liable for harassment and violation of agricultural protection statutes." Susan Walsh spoke for the first time. "Can I ask Tyler a question?" "Of course," I said. "Are you planning to expand beyond what you're doing now? Like, are you going to buy the lot next door and turn it into a bigger farm?" "No, I only have the one property and I'm happy with that. I want to grow high-quality organic vegetables, maybe make enough money to supplement my income and live a quieter life than I had in Chicago. I'm not trying to change the whole neighborhood." "What about the smell? When you spread the manure, I mean." "Properly composted manure has very little smell. It's earthy, like potting soil. I spread it once in spring and once in fall, and the spreader is only here for a day each time. If anyone found it offensive, I apologize, but it's a necessary part of organic farming." Patricia tried to interrupt, but Carol held up her hand. "Let's vote. All in favor of dropping the legal action and removing the fines against Tyler Garrison." Carol, Marcus, and Susan raised their hands. All opposed, Patricia and Jennifer raised their hands. The motion carries. "Tyler, you'll receive written confirmation that the fines have been rescinded and the lien removed." Patricia stood up abruptly. "This is a mistake. Mark my words, we're setting a precedent that will destroy this community." She stormed out, Jennifer following close behind. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to me. Some apologized for the hassle, Others asked questions about organic gardening, and a few wanted to know how they could start their own vegetable plots. Mrs. Henderson gave me a hug. "Good for you for standing your ground." I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning, I was harvesting tomatoes when I heard an engine sound that didn't belong in the neighborhood. A commercial truck was backing up to the curb in front of my house. 2 men got out and started unloading equipment. I walked over. "Can I help you? We're here to trim the trees on this property. Work order from the HOA." I didn't authorize any tree trimming. The man checked his clipboard. "Says here all trees overhanging property lines need to be trimmed back per HOA covenant compliance." I looked at my trees. Yes, a few branches extended over the property line into the easement behind my lot, but they weren't causing any problems, and the easement was county-owned land, not HOA property. "I need to see that work order." He handed me the clipboard. Sure enough, it was on HOA letterhead, signed by Patricia Thornhill, authorizing emergency tree maintenance for safety and covenant compliance. "Give me 10 minutes before you do anything," I said. I called Richard Tomlinson. "They're trying to force tree trimming on my property." "Do you have the work order?" I read it to him. "That's not legal. They can't authorize work on your property without your permission unless there's a genuine safety emergency and they follow proper notice procedures. Tell them not to touch anything until I send a cease and desist letter." I went back outside and explained the situation to the tree trimming crew. They were frustrated but understanding. "We get this kind of thing all the time with HOAs. They use us as weapons in their little wars. We'll leave and wait for clarification." After they left, I walked around my property, really looking at everything. The trees were healthy. The branches weren't threatening any structures. This was pure harassment. Richard's cease and desist letter went to both the HOA and the tree trimming company that afternoon. It explicitly stated that any unauthorized work on my property would result in immediate legal action for trespass and property damage. Monday morning, I received an email from Carol Chen. "Tyler, I apologize. Patricia authorized that tree work without board approval. It's been canceled, and I've called for another board meeting to discuss her overreach of authority." But Patricia wasn't done. That week, I received a notice that my mailbox was the wrong shade of black and needed to be repainted. A citation for parking my truck on the street overnight, which was apparently not allowed per covenants, even though half the neighborhood did it regularly. A complaint that my garden hose was visible from the street and constituted unsightly utility storage. A demand that I remove my compost bins because they violated setback requirements, even though they were well within the allowed distances. Each complaint was technically based on some obscure covenant language, but it was obvious this was a coordinated campaign. Richard sent a formal harassment complaint to the HOA board, documenting every frivolous citation and noting the pattern of selective enforcement. The second board meeting was even more contentious than the first. Richard attended with me this time, and he brought a thick file of documentation showing how Patricia was violating her duties as HOA president. "Mrs. Thornhill has abused her position by authorizing expenditures without board approval, by selectively enforcing covenants against Mr. Garrison while ignoring identical situations elsewhere in the neighborhood, and by using HOA resources to pursue a personal vendetta," Richard said. "This isn't just poor governance. It's potentially illegal and definitely grounds for a lawsuit against both Mrs. Thornhill personally and the HOA as an entity." Marcus Pritchard looked shocked. "Patricia, is this true? Did you authorize that tree trimming without asking us?" "I have the authority to make emergency decisions." That wasn't an emergency, and you know it, Carol said. Marcus, Susan, I'm making a motion to remove Patricia as president for misuse of authority and to require board approval for any future enforcement actions. We need to protect this HOA from liability. The vote was 4-1, with only Jennifer voting against. Patricia was removed as president and Carol was elected to replace her. Patricia stood up, her face red with anger. You're all going to regret this. I'll sue. I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of circus this board has become. Patricia, at this point you might want to consult with your own attorney, Richard said calmly. Because if you continue harassing my client, we will be filing a lawsuit for damages, emotional distress, and legal fees. After that meeting, things finally calmed down. Patricia stopped attending board meetings and barely left her house. Jennifer Morrison gave me cold looks when we crossed paths, but she didn't cause any more problems. My fall crops flourished. The heirloom tomatoes were incredible, and I had more produce than I could sell at the farmer's market. I started donating the excess to a local food bank and to Mrs. Henderson, who shared it with her friends. In October, I needed to spread manure again to prepare the beds for winter cover crops. I called Carol Chen first. I wanted to give you advance notice that I'll be bringing the manure spreader back this weekend. Everything will be done the same way as before, but I thought communication might help avoid any issues. I appreciate that, Tyler. I'll send an email to the neighborhood so nobody's surprised. That Saturday, I loaded up the spreader and drove through Meadowbrook Estates. A few people came out to watch, but the atmosphere was completely different. Mr. Rodriguez from 3 houses over brought his kids to see how the spreader worked. Mrs. Henderson brought me coffee. Even Marcus Pritchard stopped by to ask about starting his own small garden. I was finishing up the last bed when a Cedar Rapids police cruiser pulled up. My heart sank until I saw Officer Martinez get out with a smile. Mr. Garrison, just checking in. Got a call from someone concerned about the smell, but I told dispatch I'd handled this before and it was all legal. Let me guess who called. I can't say officially, but let's just say I'm not surprised by the source. Everything looks good here. Those are some beautiful plants you've got growing. Thanks, officer. I'm hoping for a good winter harvest. After he left, I sat down on the edge of one of the raised beds and looked at what I had built. The gardens were thriving, the soil was rich and healthy, and I was actually making a small profit from the farmers' market sales. More importantly, I was happy. For the first time in years, I was doing work that felt meaningful. Mrs. Henderson came over with a plate of cookies. You should be proud of yourself. Not many people would have stood up to Patricia the way you did. I almost gave up a few times. The stress was intense. But you didn't, and now look what you have. Half the neighborhood is talking about starting gardens next spring. You've inspired people. Over the next few months, I focused on growing and selling my produce. Winter came and my cold season crops, protected by row covers, continued producing. I sold baby lettuce, kale, and Swiss chard through the winter months at indoor markets. The income wasn't huge, but combined with some remote consulting work I picked up, I was making ends meet and building something sustainable. In February, Patricia's house went up for sale. Mrs. Henderson told me that she and her husband were moving to Arizona. Jennifer Morrison's house followed a month later. I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. I hadn't wanted to drive anyone out of the neighborhood, but I also wasn't going to abandon my dreams because they disapproved. The spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. Carol Chen asked if I would be willing to give a presentation at an HOA meeting about organic gardening and micro-farming. I agreed, and on a warm April evening, I stood in front of about 30 neighbors and talked about soil health, companion planting, and the joy of growing your own food. The thing about organic farming, I said, is that it's not just about the vegetables. It's about building a relationship with the land, understanding natural systems, and creating something sustainable. Yes, there are challenges. Yes, it sometimes involves manure spreaders and composting and things that don't look like traditional suburban landscaping. But the results speak for themselves. I brought samples of my seeds, my soil test results, and several pounds of early spring lettuce to share. By the end of the evening, 7 families had signed up for a gardening workshop I offered to host. The workshops became a regular thing. Every other Saturday, I taught small groups about organic methods, soil building, and sustainable growing. Some people just wanted to grow a few tomatoes. Others, like Marcus Pritchard, got serious about it and applied for their own micro-farm permits. The manure spreader made its spring appearance in late April. This time, nobody called the police. Instead, I had 3 neighbors ask if they could buy some of the composted manure for their own gardens. I connected them with riverside stables, and soon there was a small network of organic gardeners in Meadowbrook Estates. One afternoon in May, I was transplanting tomato seedlings when Richard Tomlinson called. "Tyler, I wanted to let you know that the HOA's insurance company contacted me. They're concerned about potential liability from Patricia's actions and want to make sure everything is settled. They're offering to reimburse your legal fees and issue a formal apology." I wasn't expecting that. The insurance company did an investigation after Patricia was removed as president. They found a pattern of misuse of authority and selective enforcement that put the HOA at significant legal risk. They're trying to clean house before someone else gets targeted and decides to sue. What about Patricia? Does she face any consequences? That's complicated. Technically, she could be sued personally for harassment and abuse of authority. But Carol Chen and the new board don't want to go down that road. They think it's better to let her leave quietly and move on. I thought about it. Part of me wanted justice, wanted Patricia to understand how much stress and anxiety she had caused. But another part of me just wanted to move forward. Tell them I'll accept the reimbursement and the apology. I don't want to spend the next year in court battles. That's probably wise. I'll draft the settlement agreement. The formal apology came 2 weeks later, signed by Carol Chen on behalf of the HOA board. It acknowledged that my agricultural activities were legal and protected, apologized for the harassment and frivolous enforcement actions, and confirmed that I was a valued member of the Meadowbrook Estates community. It felt good to have that validation in writing. Summer arrived, and my gardens exploded with growth. The tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, the peppers gleamed in shades of red and yellow and orange, and the zucchini produced more than anyone could possibly eat. I was at the farmer's market 3 days a week, and I had developed a loyal customer base who specifically sought out my organic produce. Mrs. Henderson became my unofficial taste tester and quality control expert. She would come over in the evenings, and we would sit on my porch, eating sun-warmed tomatoes and talking about her father's Victory Garden, her late husband, and the changes she had seen in her lifetime. "You know what I like most about what you've done?" she said one evening in July. "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You showed people a different way of living. Half this neighborhood was sleepwalking through life, focused on lawn perfection and property values. You reminded us that there's more to life than appearances. I was just trying to grow vegetables." That's what makes it so powerful. You weren't trying to start a revolution. You just wanted to live according to your values, and you didn't let anyone stop you. In August, the Extension Office asked if they could feature my operation in a case study about successful micro-farms. Marcus Webb came out with a photographer and spent a whole day documenting my setup, my processes, and the results I had achieved. "You're exactly the kind of success story we need," Marcus said. "Someone who figured out how to make small-scale organic farming work in a suburban context." The Right to Farm Act was designed to protect operations like yours, but most people don't know how to navigate the legal complexities. I had a lot of help, and a good lawyer. Sure, but you also had the courage to fight back when the HOA tried to shut you down. That matters. The case study was published in September, and suddenly, I was getting calls from people all over Iowa who were dealing with similar HOA conflicts. I wasn't qualified to give legal advice, but I could share my experience and connect people with resources. Richard Tomlinson ended up getting several new clients from my referrals. Fall came around again, and it was time for the manure spreader. By now, it had become something of a neighborhood event. I sent out an email announcing when I would be spreading, and instead of complaints, I got requests from 8 neighbors who wanted to coordinate their own manure applications. We made a day of it. I brought the spreader from my grandfather's barn early in the morning, and we worked our way through the neighborhood, fertilizing all the new organic gardens that had sprung up. Marcus Pritchard provided coffee and donuts. The Rodriguez family grilled burgers for lunch. It felt like an old-fashioned barn raising, everyone pitching in to help each other. Officer Martinez drove by in the afternoon and stopped to watch. "This is not what I expected when I responded to that first call last year." "Life is full of surprises," I said. "Keep doing what you're doing, Mr. Garrison. The world needs more of this." As the seasons turned and my second full year in Meadowbrook Estates began, I realized that I had found something I didn't even know I was looking for. It wasn't just about the farming, though I loved that. It wasn't just about standing up to the HOA, though that had been necessary. It was about building a life that aligned with my values and creating a community of people who supported each other. The gardens continued to thrive. My customer base at the farmers' markets grew. I was making enough money to live comfortably, not getting rich but earning an honest living doing work I believed in. More importantly, I was healthy, happy, and connected to the land in a way I never had been during my years in Chicago. One evening in late October, Carol Chen stopped by with her husband. "Tyler, the board wanted to thank you properly for what you've done for this community. We know the first year was rough, but you've changed this place for the better." She handed me a gift. Inside was a plaque that read, "In appreciation to Tyler Garrison for demonstrating that community is built not by enforcing conformity but by respecting diversity and supporting each other's dreams." I was genuinely touched. "Thank you. This means a lot." "No, thank you. You taught us something important about what really matters." As they left, I sat on my porch and looked out at the gardens, now being put to bed for winter. The raised beds were mulched, the tools were cleaned and stored, and the soil was resting, building strength for next year's growing season. My phone buzzed with a text from my grandfather. "How are the gardens?" "Better than I ever imagined," I typed back. "Thank you for teaching me all of this. I didn't teach you the most important part, that you figured out yourself." "What's that?" "That growing food is about more than food. It's about growing yourself and your community too." He was right. When I moved to Meadowbrook Estates with my permits and my plans and my vintage manure spreader, I thought I was just starting a small farming operation. I didn't realize I was starting a quiet revolution, one that would transform not just my own life, but the entire neighborhood. The HOA that had tried to stop me was now supporting me. The neighbors who had complained were now asking for advice. The police who had been called to shut down my agricultural activities now stopped by to admire the gardens and buy tomatoes. It had been a long, difficult fight. There were moments when I wanted to give up, when the stress and the harassment and the legal battles felt like too much. But I kept going because I believed in what I was doing, and because I had the law on my side, and because giving up would have meant abandoning not just my dreams but my principles. As winter settled in and the gardens went dormant, I started planning for the next year. New crops to try, new techniques to implement, new ways to serve the community. The manure spreader was back in my grandfather's barn in North Liberty, waiting for spring. When the time came, I would load it up again, drive it through the gates of Meadowbrook Estates and spread organic nutrition across the soil. And this time, nobody would call the police. Instead, they would call their neighbors and say, "Tyler's spreading manure today. Want to bring your garden beds over and get some?" That transformation, from conflict to cooperation, from fear to understanding, was the real harvest. The tomatoes and peppers and lettuce were wonderful, but the relationships and the community we had built together were what made it all worthwhile. I had come to Iowa looking for a quieter life and the chance to farm organically. What I found was a home, a purpose, and a community of people who learned to embrace a different vision of suburban life. We proved that neighborhoods don't have to choose between property values and property values. We could have both: beautiful spaces and productive spaces, aesthetic harmony and agricultural abundance. The extension office was right. Fertilizing organic vegetable plots with properly composted manure was not just legal and recommended, it was essential. But more than that, it was an act of connection to the land, to food systems, to heritage, and to each other. As I closed up the house for the night and looked out one last time at the mulched beds resting under the starlight, I smiled. Let other people have their perfect lawns and their strict HOA covenants. I had something better: dirt under my fingernails, vegetables in my root cellar, and a community that had learned to grow together. The manure spreader would return in spring, and when it did, it would be welcomed. Not as a symbol of defiance or conflict, but as a tool of transformation, turning waste into fertility, conflict into cooperation, and a suburban neighborhood into something that honored both the past and the future. That was worth fighting for. That was worth standing up to HOA presidents and lawyers and fines and harassment. Because in the end, what I defended was not just my right to farm, but everyone's right to live according to their values, to pursue their dreams, and to build the kind of life and community they believed in. The gardens slept, but they were not dead. Beneath the mulch, the soil was alive with microorganisms, breaking down organic matter, building fertility, preparing for the explosion of growth that would come with spring. That was the real magic of organic farming. Understanding that what looked like nothing was actually everything, that patience and proper preparation led to abundance, and that sometimes you had to fight through a difficult season to reach the harvest on the other side. I had reached my harvest, and it was sweeter than any tomato.